I'd like to, draw attention to everything that the committee has done here. Really put on an outstanding meeting. So Brian, Ty, Susan, Tunisia, Marco, everybody, you guys really did a good job, and you picked a really nice place. This picture was, I believe, from the first Sanibel meeting, and my wife and I were, I think we were a little higher there, but this was, you see how the boat was docking back then, and now they reversed it, so it's on the end. Yeah, altitude. Oh, Ty said you're talking about altitude, right? And but it's just a great place. I think probably one of the finest locations for any meeting in the country today. But we are going to talk now about heater coolers. And as a disclaimer, I probably am no more knowledgeable about this than anybody in the room, but I serve on the FDA panel for medical devices, myself and Jeff Riley, and so we were involved at ground zero with what happened last year when everything was coming to a point. And I think nothing has really affected perfusionists, at least in my career in the last 31 years, more than that Sachs paper that occurred in 2015. That changed our lives dramatically. And I think everybody in the room here can appreciate that. I know we have heater cooler manufacturers in the room too. I'd like to call attention to the wonderful work they have done. I mean, these people have gone above and beyond the mandates to go ahead and to improve the quality of the devices that we are currently having and are much safer than the past. But we're going to go over three things. Talk about heater coolers as sources of nosocomial infections, talk about how we can reduce the risk, and then talk about what the federal guidelines are. I am not representing the FDA. I just want to state that, even though we do serve on that panel. To begin, Heinz Weitkamper from Bad Oeynhausen, he submitted this paper when I was the editor of the journal, and I really thought, are we going to publish this or not? I mean, this was back in 2001, and it got through publication in 2002, and I felt that, who ever heard of a heater cooler borne infection? I mean, that just doesn't occur. But Heinz, thank goodness, was smarter than the rest of us, and this predated the Sachs publication by 13 years. And what he had done was installed filters in the heater cooler lines. On the left-hand side, this is a non-filtered heater cooler line with the amount of biofilm and bacterial growth that is occurring. And once you filter it, on the right-hand side, a lot of that goes away. Not the microscopic depositions that we're all aware of, but at least the macroscopic. As I mentioned, Hugo Sachs, an epidemiologist located in University Hospital in Zurich, published this landmark paper in 2015. Exquisite research they've done, and several other papers that have followed up since then have brought this to our attention. And we first heard of the Mycobacterium chimaera, which we'll talk about in just a second. And who had heard of that? This bacteria was only first described 11 years before that time period. It's brand new. Now, of course, we're all aware of it because there are a large number of lawsuits that have already been filed against quite a few institutions in this country. Perfusionists are being cited in those lawsuits. It is something that has become a real important issue to us, and if you search on heater coolers, this is what comes up right away. This was yesterday. But also, look at individual hospitals. I just pulled this one up. This is Thomas Jefferson Hospital. And what they did on their website is they published this. As of the December 28th, TJU is no longer using the Soren Stockert 3T, and they've been fully replaced with CardioQuip. And then a couple other hospitals that they're affiliated with, they said, we've never used those devices. So hospital administrators feel that it's important enough that they go ahead and they proclaim that they're devoid of these particular devices. Last month, or a month and a half ago, in New England Journal of Medicine, this letter to the editors from the researchers at the University of Melbourne described the genetic identification of these particular organisms and stated that they're more than likely coming from a single point source. And we'll talk about that just in a second. And there is one case that has occurred in the Australian Asian market in New Zealand. So their departments of health are very well aware of this. And this is what they had said. Our observations highlight the potential for global dissemination of contaminated medical devices. So this is not a small issue. This is something that is big. And this is probably one of the first things that has affected all of us across the entire globe. And we'll talk about that when we get into some numerics. ECRI, last December, I'm not sure if anybody in the room attended their online webinar, but they identified that the heater-cooler infections as the 5th most significant risk facing patients in 2017. So this is really something that is real, and it's not going away. This will be with us for probably the rest of our lives. Well, what are Mycobacterium chimaera? Why are they so insidious? Why are they difficult to determine? They're a slow-growing non-tuberculous Mycobacterium, NTMs. They belong to a MAC classification, which are the Mycobacterium avian complex, we'll talk about in a second. As I said, 2004, they're found everywhere. I mean, you can't do away with them in our drinking water. They're found here because the EPA guidelines for drinking water state that they only have to reduce the colony-forming units down to a level of about 500 in this country. In Europe, it's down to 100. Dialysis, it's down to 100. But I mean, these are levels that are found. You're going to find them. If you have a hot tub, you know, they're definitely in every hot tub, in any pool. So if you were in the hot tub out here yesterday trying to stay warm with the cold, you probably were exposed to large concentrations of them. They're opportunistic. They go after immunocompromised patients, hence heart surgery. I mean, anybody we operate on is going to be at risk for these. As I said, these MAC organisms are lipid-rich hydrophobic outer membranes, and these things are impervious to disinfection with chlorine. They concentrate on water surfaces, and they result in extremely high concentrations of that biofilm that can be liberated very, very easily. Well, what do we know? What are the type of infections that are out there? Endocarditis, deep surgical site infections, disseminated infections, bacteremic embolizations, basically the gamut of what our heart patients are seeing. That's why they're so hard to determine, because our patients get these infections. You know, 1% the STS says we're going to have median stenitis and deep sternal wound, and probably 3% with surface wounds. Well, that's not something that's very evident. In fact, if you did a statistical analysis on trying to determine the etiology of those infections, you would need thousands and thousands of patients when you have a 1% risk that is being reported. Delayed clinical diagnosis, the incubation periods can take 7 months to several years to go ahead and grow. That's why the FDA has said don't do microbial analysis unless you have an infection. Don't go ahead and do it. There's false negatives, and you're not going to grow something today that will be present tomorrow. And lack of clinical awareness. Where do they affect individuals in the United States? People think that there's probably over 350 cases, and that's probably even too small. There's probably quite a few more. But in 24 cases reported by Cameruri, valve prostheses, 46% were found, vascular grafts in 29, heart transplant 13, and CABG 1. And there have been studies that have looked at CABG and valves, same operative procedure, the same time that you had the heater cooler on, and you had the same bypass time, the same cross clamp time, and you still have a 4-fold increased risk associated with valve patients that have prosthetic materials as opposed to coronaries. One child case has been reported so far. Underestimation is because they're not routinely conducted. You know, you don't normally culture for these things in endocarditis, and then the routine blood cultures have a low sensitivity. Well, what do we know? What is some of the information that is out there in regards to how these are disseminated? I'd like to play for a second, hopefully it'll work, a really nice study that was done by Summerstein, and this is on YouTube. And let's just see if we can get this to go here. Oh, you know what? It's playing on my screen, but not that one. Any ideas why that happens? Well, you know what? I bet I know, and I apologize. Let me do this. I'm going to back out of this just for a second and see if this comes up. And it takes a few minutes for this to appear, so I think we'll be okay. And there we are. This was done by Summerstein, the individuals at Zurich who actually first identified these type of infections, Mycobacterium. What they did is they put a heater cooler in an operating room, lit a smoke bomb underneath it, which you'll see momentarily, and then just showed the importance of directing heater coolers away from an operative field. And I've used a 3T for decades, and I'll just show this. On the left-hand side is the exhaust being vented directly towards the field, and you'll see how once the fan is on and the heater cooler, that gentleman is turning it on right now, look at how far these things disperse. This was a non-laminar flow, and on the left-hand side on the bottom, I'm sorry, is where it is. So these are being aerosolized throughout the entire operating room. On the upper side is where they reverse the unit so that now you're facing not away from it. The exhaust fan, there's several exhaust fans, but it's facing away from the operative field. And on the bottom right-hand side just shows how these things could have dispersed very easily within the operating room. For 10 years, that bottom picture is how I ran the heater cooler in my operating rooms and several of them. So it definitely is something that I think with ignorance we would go ahead and use that formation. And I am just going to get back to this here, and let's see where we end up. There we go. Great. So let's talk about a timeline now for what went on. What's the history with this? As I mentioned, the first cases that were reported in literature were 2015, but if you look at when they occurred, these were surgeries that were far back as 2007. In Zurich, 2008 to 2014, the 6-patient outbreak. Germany soon thereafter, and Netherlands at the same time. So those 3 countries were the first to report about it. In the United States, it occurred in southeastern Pennsylvania, hospital in York, Pennsylvania, that reported the first nesting or outbreak of infections. And then the Bavarian Health and Food Safety Authority did a review of the German Stockert plant where these devices were made. In October 2015, the FDA, CDC, and everybody throughout Europe and other countries were releasing safety alerts that there's a problem. Whole genomic sequencing had found in April of 2016 that these organisms more than likely, almost confirmatory, were coming from the Stockert plant. And that's why the FDA issued the pre-September 2014 alert stating that if you have devices made before then from the 3T plant in Stockert, that you should be aware of the potential issues. After our panel meeting, that the safety alerts that came out from the CDC and FDA, and then Chan recently reported on an outbreak in the United Kingdom with 18 individual cases of these Mycobacterium chimaera infections. And as I mentioned, there have been 20 publications on heater-cooler related infections, journals as pronounced as New England Journal of Medicine, right down to every infectious disease in the last 7 months. So this is something that is real and not going away. Just to finalize, LivaNova did put 3 field safety alerts out in June, August, and October of this past year. So how great is the risk? The next question to answer is just 3 slides here. I mean, how do you determine, oh, this is rare, we all know that, but how rare is it? This was ECRI. This was the report that came out in the end of last year. And they just did some simple epidemiological studies, and they said if you have 250,000 open heart procedures, 20 to 50 NTM infections that occurred with the 3T, 3Ts used in 60%, 100,000 surgeries or with affected HCU, that comes out to that bottom calculation, or a rate of infection of 0.0125, or 1 in 8,000 surgeries. So that's something to be aware of. The CDC said, you know what, if you have an infection at your hospital, that increases now to 1 in 100 and 1 in 1,000. So if you do have a reported infection, and a lot of us assume that we probably did, just went undetected, that may be the real values to go for. And then finally, a paper by Shand and others from the UK, looking at records from 2007 to 2015, looked at the occurrence of these and related it to HIV patients who developed these type of NTM opportunistic infections. And what they had found, this green line right here, are HIV patients, showing that what the NTM, you can see a wide standard deviation. But on the red line here are the infection rate that is occurring from patients who have undergone cardiac surgery for valve replacement. And it mirrors HIV patients. So they've come out and predicted that the same rate of NTM infections with individuals who are suffering from HIV are the same thing that cardiac surgery patients, at least in the UK, who have undergone valve replacement or repair, can expect to find. Well, what about the Sorin 3T? And we're going to talk about other devices in a little bit, but what do we know about this? I mean, it's a wonderful device. Everybody who's used it, I can't imagine anybody would say it's not a good device. It's, you know, we loved it, and, you know, we purchased a whole bunch of these things. You know, it got rid of multiple devices. It really was phenomenal. It's a 3-circuit system. It has 3 independent tanks, each with a volume of about 6 liters. It's compressor-based interchangeable units. There are, you know, you can do oxygenator, bedside, and cardioplegia. However, this study, Haller, that came out in late 2016, looked specifically, this was by the German authorities and published in European Surveillance, and they shown that once they reviewed the Stockert plant, LivaNova, Sorin, was very, very open to try to find the cause of these type of infections. There's been no totally transparent, and the authors of this paper actually stated that. They said whole genome sequencing said that there's a similar lineage to these type of bacterial organisms. In fact, that it probably is a point source contamination. In fact, the lineage, the phylogenetic aspects of these organisms were the same ones that were found in Pennsylvania, the same ones that were found in Iowa and throughout the world. So they came from this single source, which was the Starker plant. Well, fine and good. How do they get out? How do you aerosolize that? I mean, we rack our brains and we think about how is this aerosolation occurring. And this Chan's paper had shown that you have these vents that are in the back of the 3T and these little openings and cracks here, and that if you did a analysis by placing, well, first what they did is they analyzed the CFUs with the device off, which were under 10, and then with the device on, that increased 50-fold. So once you turn the device on is when you liberate those type of organisms and they become aerosolized. As long as you have the device off, it's going to be fine. So if you don't want to use the device and just use it as we used to put our records on top of that, that's a great storage facility. But for the most part, most of us are going to be turning it on. But more importantly, what they had shown was these three graphs right here, no circulation is right there. So if you have it off, the amount of, the mean number of particles that are being aerosolized is basically 0. If you have no circulation of water, but you take those holes and you put seals over it, LivaNova has already done this. But if you seal those holes, you still have none. So those holes were implicated as where organisms were coming from. If you turn it on with no sealant, this is where you get that tenfold increase in organisms being dispersed. Well, what else happens? We know biofilms occur. In fact, anybody using the dual heater cooler, the SARNs, the 1160, the standby that we've all used and grew up on, absolutely still a workhorse in the unit. They were the first ones in their heater coolers that I'm aware of to actually say biofilm. That this occurred in the late 70s, early 80s, I believe. Well, this just shows a 3T with biofilm formed on the overflow tubing of the 3T heater cooler. So these researchers, Garvey and all from Birmingham, UK and England, they said, well, let's do a decontamination process. And I apologize for how hard this is to see, but I thought it was pretty interesting. So they followed the manufacturer's instructions for use. They had greater than 300 CFUs, and this is what they were able to grow: gram-negatives, Pseudomonas, fungi, and chimaera. So probably something that we're all not very shocked with. If you then changed your regimen, where they did 2 decontamination processes, they emptied the heater cooler every day. I don't know if you remember, if anybody read the FDA transcripts, but they said, we're just going to make the recommendation that every heater cooler is emptied every day and refilled. And luckily there were perfusionists who were there and say that will probably cause more deaths, with restricting individuals to have open heart surgery because of the time necessitated to. Can you imagine doing that every day on these devices? So luckily they didn't come out with that recommendation, but that's what these people did. And you could see now the CFUs are actually still present, weekly counts at 1 to 300. That's why hydrogen peroxide is added. Then if you actually change from a chlorine-based system into a peracetic acid, they almost go away. So at a week time period, you still have this small amount of organisms that are being grown, but if you change the tubing, you get rid of that biofilm and take it out of the circuit, they're gone. Everything is gone. So that was the recommendation, and that's hence some of the manufacturers specifically are going and removing this with a deep decontamination process. Schreiber et al. Said, well, how effective are the intensified cleaning protocols that we're using? And they had placed special filters on the front and the rear of the devices, in the mitigation systems. But unfortunately, even doing this, they were able to show that they did away with the aerosolization of these organisms in the air, but they still were growing in the water. So if you cultured that water, you would still grow them. They just weren't ending up in the operating room. This is the urosurveillance research that had come out in regards to how widespread is the contamination, and this was specifically during ECMO. What's going on in ECMO? It was really worrisome that all these ECMO heater coolers are out there. And this study had shown that 9 out of 18 water samples from 10 different heater coolers were culturing the devices. No bacteria were found liberated in the air, so they weren't aerosolized. However, among 118 patients, 76 had bronchial positive specimens for Mycobacteria, and it was found without any sign of active infection, at least at this point that the research was done. And their bottom line was, this is a real problem with ECMO patients, and it needs to be considered carefully if you are using heater coolers, as most ECMOs are. Okay, so what about the general literature? Consumer Reports in November of 2016 came out and stated, the vast majority of these infections are involving the levodopa, 3T. We all know that, and we'll see why in just a second. But at least 3 other companies' devices also have been linked to contaminations, and both the FDA and CDC have acknowledged that concern goes beyond any one brand. So, when we're thinking about changing, we just have to keep that in mind, and we'll show some additional data there. Soren was kind enough to share this information with the feds as well as we as perfusionists, and this just shows their interpretation of how many heater coolers are used throughout, I believe this was the world, I don't think this was American. I know there's some Soren people in the back, so if you can correct me, please, I appreciate it. But 60% 3T use throughout the world today, and that's what ECRI used to go ahead and do their estimate of 1 in 8,000 procedures. Well, what about isolates from Denmark and United States and others? And this was a study that looked at different heater coolers, and it said that 80% of Mackay's devices contained M. chimaera, although they were different from the Soren 3Ts, again, pointing to that point source origin for where these organisms are coming from, and that they said it may be a general problem for all devices. And then finally, Sommerstein and Hugo Sachs from the Zurich group also said that studies with the different brands are needed for additional risk assessment, and that's what occurred at the FDA as well. We all agreed that nobody's off the hook, and that's why the companies have done a phenomenal job with addressing this. If you summarize what's in the literature for what type of devices have been reported, these are 5 studies that I've identified. Most of them Mycobacteria, Pseudomonas legionella. Unfortunately, some of these other studies by Godding and Haller didn't tell us what type of heater coolers they were. They said they weren't 3Ts, but they didn't tell us what they were. Not that it would really matter, since we know that the organisms are found in the water sources themselves. Let's shift gears and talk about federal regulations, and that's important because this is what really the rubber meets the road, what we're supposed to be doing. Everybody in the room is aware of what the CDC and FDA said. I mean, we all are aware of this. If you read their guidelines, the very first one was make sure you're following the IFUs. We at SpecialtyCare, all of this is documented, which we'll go over. I know Perfusion.com is doing the exact same thing, and I'm sure every company and every hospital is following these very, very carefully. Clinician training, this was not stated. This was not stated in the FDA, but a lot of people who are doing this worldwide believe that you need to have competency assessments for your individuals. It's not just okay to say follow the IFUs, you need to show them what to be done. And the reasons that we do competency are to assure consistency with what we're teaching our individuals, ourselves and associates, to make sure that we're finding this and then have people sign off on it and document it. Well, SpecialtyCare, is a big organization, and in 2015, we were using 468 devices that we were responsible for throughout the United States. So we're the biggest heater cooler user in the world today, and that's one of the reasons the FDA has worked closely with us to make sure that what we're doing is in compliance with what else. And this pie diagram just shows the distribution. The red is Levanova. The colors are always going to be the same. Trumo. And then green is Quest, and then the blue is Cincinnati Sub-Zero. That made up the primary devices that we had. Today, we're up to just under 500 heater coolers, and you can see, I'm going to show the next slide, the change, but not a real big shift in at least the amount of color. But if you pick the big 3Ts, Cincinnati Sub-Zero, and the CardioQuip, we had about a 3% drop with the use of the 3Ts. We had about a 1.1% increase in the use of Cincinnati Sub-Zeros, and we've increased almost 5-fold with the use of CardioQuip within the organization. I'm sure you spoke with the manufacturers. They have a very hard time keeping these things on the shelf, so they're very difficult to get. The feds came out and said document, 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 document. We've spoken with a number of the hospitals that are being implicated in the class action lawsuits that have been started. And thank goodness none of them were specialty care accounts, but every individual we spoke with about it said they had very good documentation. Last year, when we knew all this was coming, we designed an application for our organization that allowed all of this to be followed online electronically. So this is where a perfusionist would load the information. This just happens to show a particular hospital. And then what occurs, that hospital has these devices, so when you put in your hospital number or name, these devices come up, these are loaded in there. This brings you to the next screen, and we have 11 observations of what's going on with the heater cooler maintenance. And there are 3 values that we can enter here, and if you have a no or an NA, you have to have a comment. That's all fine and good. Then what happens with the reporting? We use a couple of dashboards to go ahead and track. We can track by manufacturer, model number, or the institution. So in this particular example, we picked up this institution here. They have Medtronic and SARNS devices, the number of the 1160, the BioCal, and so forth. So if you look at the results, that's how you can delve down into your individual hospital. We have, I think, 210 hospitals or something. So it's a big database. So here's the report right now. This is the first screen. So of those 500 devices, how many people are having the heater cooler maintenance done? This was February's data, so they're still loading it. We're at 72% penetration. They're the 11%. Trend analysis over time, it's a 12-month rolling time frame. And then if you wanted to look at specific devices, well, how are we doing with the LevaNovas? We have 176 of them. And this is the results of the observations for maintenance and the trend analysis. We can do that this is the SARNS dual heater cooler. And then we can actually go down to the individual hospital. So this is a individual hospital, just a made up. And you can see, our target is always 100%. Anything less than 100% is considered a variance. There's no benchmarking. There's no, as long as you're within a certain percentile, you'll be okay. No, it's 100% or none. And you can see for water lines changed according to IFUs, this particular center was missing that by 50%. And then if you say, okay, if you click on that, it brings up that hospital, and it says where are the problems that occurred in October 2016. Green is compliant, red is non. And then if you click further on that, it tells you what was not done. So, and you can see what the individual had typed in and why there was a negative response. Just a way of documenting this. I'm sure Perfusion.com has the same, and other companies that are out there, and probably individual hospitals. The one thing you don't want to have is paper records. Absolutely do not have paper records. Those are the minimal characteristics for documenting this information. It absolutely needs to be done electronically. Jeff and I wrote this paper after the FDA panel. It was published basically almost the same day that we submitted it. It was such an important thing. And this is the recommendations that had come out from the publications. The very first 2 slides are going to be mandatory. These are things that are mandatory that people throughout the world have told us we need to be doing. And a lot of this is really following instructions. And again, everybody in the room here is shaking your head, I do that. And that's great. But this is what people had said should be done. Checklist at the bottom. Clinical competencies, as mentioned, should be used. Document what's going on, document. And all water used for HCB should be filtered. These are from the IFUs. Then we had a second classification. These are not mandatory, these are suggested recommendations. So those first ones, if you had to put them into an analysis, you'd say those were Class 1A type of recommendations. And I don't think anybody would perhaps argue that. So in the second one, monitoring bacterial growth through heterotopic plate counts. This is done specifically if you've had an infection. Reduce any open points onto the oxygenator. Where possible, position the heart-lung machine and lamina. These are in that paper, and these are what were published. Limit turning the device on, position it so that it's, all the things that I think everybody is doing today. Omit the use of non-disposable mounting systems. The companies have all gone away from the non-disposable mounting systems, so those are a source of infection. The ones that you're plugging in to those heater cooler units, get rid of those. Those are absolutely not acceptable. And then disinfect at a regular time period. Additional considerations, these are very controversial, and many people in discussions that we've had throughout the country, some individuals have moved the heater cooler device out of the operating room. That is not a recommendation. That is a localized response if you're doing that. There's a lot of issues that were discussed in the federal panel on this, and why it probably is not a good idea. Put it in encased housing. That's what a lot of the Europeans are doing. And then, simplistically put a blanket over the exhaust, which the manufacturers are crowing about because those exhausts are used to cool the devices. In conclusion, infections resulting from contaminated heater cooler units are rare, but when they are found, they're devastating. Over 50% mortality that's associated with these devices, and some they're a lot higher, but 50% is general for almost 300 plus cases. And following the IFUs will reduce but not eliminate the potential for biofilm formation. That's absolutely important. Doesn't matter what heater cooled device it is, if it's not appropriately maintained, it will have an increased propensity towards this biofilm, and if it is appropriately maintained, you'll just limit it. It will still occur. A couple of days ago, we got here early, thanks to Brian, and we were able to go down to Key West, and if anybody's done this, you've seen the southernmost point. There's a line of about 50 people that were waiting to get their picture taken by this. Barb and I snuck up to the front and kind of looked the other direction and snapped a quick shot. But if you turn around, this was on a post of a house that they were renovating directly behind it. And it was actually Barb's recommendation, goes, take a picture to get that in. So with that, I thank you very much for the opportunity to share those, that information, and be more than welcome to hear comments. Or, yeah.